Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artist Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast. I'm your host, Ron Fortier. Our podcasts feature local contemporary artists, art industry professionals, scholars, genealogists, art lovers, and whoever drops by. It's brought to you in part by theartistindex.com. The Artist Index is a local resource for artists, art professionals, and art lovers. And I'm going to let our guest introduce themselves for the record. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Brodesky.
And how do you pronounce that?
Brodesky.
And how do you spell Brodesky?
Yeah, well, it's complicated for some people, but really not that difficult. I used to work with somebody who said it's like take the word desk and put bro in front of it and Y at the end. Okay. So it's Brodesky.
That sounds good.
It's pronounced Brodesky, not Brodsky.
Not Brodsky. Yeah. Okay, I'm sure you get that a lot, right?
Yeah, that seems to be the default for many, many people. Surprisingly, there are people that get it right the first time. And then there's also people that will pronounce it Brodesky, which is probably the original last name.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you do, Bob?
I'm a full-time artist. I have a studio in my home. It's in my attic. I am a contemporary expressionistic artist that principally paints figures. The figures are made up. They're out of my head. I don't use models. I don't use photographs for the most part. Sometimes I do look at photographs just for inspiration, but essentially it's all just out of my head, and whatever happens, happens. I'm more of a process painter. I'm not someone that is fixed on an image and my intent while I'm painting is to complete that image. It is something my paintings develop over time. They're usually a surprise as to what actually results, and that I think is sort of an ultimate, and it's really sort of a fine quality, and I tend to consider it to be what an artist is all about. It's sort of being an artist's artist.
It sort of flashed in my head about Michelangelo, who would look at a block of stone and see the figure imprisoned in it. And he said his job was to take away everything that wasn't the figure. And for some reason, when you were just speaking, it's almost like the same thing. You're adding and subtracting until you get to whatever that thing is that you can't see.
That's right. So I tend to work, on canvases principally. I don't usually draw my images out. I might, put in a very, fundamental, quick sketch, but really it's not definitive. I'm not looking to fill in the spaces. So as you said, a lot of what happens is applying the paint, looking how that paint works within the space of the canvas. I then will make decisions as to color, or I'll make decisions as to what I want to add next or where I'm going to eliminate. I tend to think about painting outside the lines of whatever I am creating. So it's really becomes a process, a systematic process of looking at the elements in the painting and trying to get them to talk to one another, but then talk to me as to what needs to be added, what needs to be deleted, what needs to be scraped away.
Okay. One more question about your process. When you decide, okay, I'm going to get up out of my chair, I'm going to go to my studio, and I'm going to paint, do you already have an idea what you're going to do, or do you just stare at the canvas and go,
It's a combination. I mean, there are times that, there is imagery that is in my mind. There is something of a narrative in my mind. But there have been instances and periods of time where I am just looking at a canvas and I'm sort of emoting as to what I'm going to create. And then really what I'm doing in those instances is creating the dynamics of different images as to how they relate to each other, what they're communicating potentially to one another. Even though it's about the figures are in some ways communicating, it's also up to the spectator to interpret and sort of get emotionally involved in what the dynamic of those figures might be. There's been some concern, I've had some concern that with that approach, I'm a little bit losing sense of a narrative. And then it becomes a little bit more difficult for the spectators to sort of relate to the work. So there are instances, and I've been doing this more lately, where I'm working with a narrative, but the narrative is not essentially defining the final look of what is being created. So one of the narratives that I'm working with right now is how it has to do with communication, but it's also creating some other physical elements within the painting that help people understand that it's about communication. So there are maybe images of a bird within the painting. There might be an image of an old-fashioned push-button telephone in the painting, so that people can start to say, okay, I get what maybe is happening between these two people. It's about communication, and it's about messaging, and what could that message be? More recently, I had a dream which had to do with telephoning my mother, and because I was upset and I wanted to talk to her about it. And so that generated a painting, which once again was about messaging, and it included a telephone as well as a bird. So the telephone sort of is an old-fashioned telephone. It talks about the past. It really relates to the past, but the bird relates to, you need to move on, you need to fly away. You need to start your own life.
Okay, all right. I can't help it the way my mind works, but as you were speaking, I was getting these flashes of your process. Having seen your work, being very familiar with your work, having written an article about you for Artscope magazine, and when you're speaking about the narrative, for some weird reason, all I could think of was you in this dark, large house with a lot of rooms and corridors, and somebody saying Marco and you saying Polo, and trying to get to that person. It's like this crazy journey getting to that person. I don't know. Does that make any sense to you at all?
Well, clearly, I think for any of us, there's got to be a realization that our lives are a journey. We all have a path to follow. Sometimes it's hard to know what that path is, how we're going, where we're going. I've spent a lot of time, trying to figure out my path. It's not always been a straight path. A lot of people like to think about your path as being sequential, but in a lot of ways, I think it's not. It's really your path sort of spirals up, spirals down. And that's something that I've experienced, of having these spiraling moments, whether it's going up or going down. I've known since I was a kid, probably maybe 5 years old, that I've always wanted to be an artist. If my mother was alive, she would tell you about how I ruined the linens in my bed because I was in bed painting as a little boy. But anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that I have not always been able to do it full time. I would say in my 20s and into my early 30s, besides having a full-time job, I was able to work steadily. I would go to my studio at night at, say, 5:30, 6 o'clock, and work until 11 or 12, and then work all weekend. But that did change because I decided that I really, I was committed to a family. And also in the meantime, I had a very demanding professional career in a very different area, and an area that many people say, well, how does that jive with even being an artist or having an artistic perspective or with your personality? So
what was that area?
Well, I worked in transportation. I was a transportation planner, transportation management consultant. I mean, I did some very different, unique projects. I was the project manager for the site selection for the new airport that eventually got built in Denver back in the 70s and 80s. I've worked for the Panama Canal. I've worked on the Transbay, or what's now called the Salesforce terminal, that eventually got built in downtown San Francisco. That was about a year ago. It's sort of the Grand Central Station of San Francisco. So I've had a very interesting career in that area, but at the same time, it created a lot of conflict for me as to knowing myself and knowing what I thought always was my true path, which was being a full-time artist.
Okay, so sticking with that theme, let's go backwards in time to let's do bio first. We'll save education for next, but background, family upbringing, that kind of thing.
Okay. I grew up outside of New York City on Long Island. It was a family of four. I have an older brother who's 4 years older. I grew up in a family that always had an artistic interest. It was evident in generations that there was this sort of passed along in our DNA an ability, an artistic ability. I grew up knowing that my grandmother was painting. My mother was, I would not say a painter, but somebody who had a strong artistic bent and really was good at sort of crafts and doing, interior design, that kind of thing. My grandmother always told us, and I don't know how true it is that her father had gotten an art degree at a university in Odessa, Russia. So there is, you can see this emergence of an artistic ability in generations. My family was always good about taking my brother and me into New York City. We went to the museums frequently. We were exposed to plays within New York. So there was this continued interest in the arts throughout my childhood. I was encouraged by my family to start taking art lessons very seriously when I was about 15. I started going every Saturday to the art school at the Brooklyn Museum, which I don't know if it still exists, but at that time was recognized as a good art program, art school. And I would say for me as a teenager, that was momentous. It was really sort of getting me out of the element of sort of the suburban Long Island high school and mixing me up with other teenagers that had similar interests, and really sort of gave me a safe place growing up. So I was very fortunate to be able to have that.
Is there any flashback moment that you keep going back to from your childhood, that one thing that kind of just hangs in your mind?
I can't say that there's any, with regards to my artistic interests, I can't say that there's a flashback moment of memory or anything like that, other than knowing that, yes, this is something that, was important to me. I would say, though, when I was in elementary school, the first few years were not necessarily easy for me. It was a little bit difficult for me to really catch on as to how to read. And I really didn't learn proficiently to read until probably fourth grade. But in the meantime, in the elementary school that I went to, there was an art program. There was an art teacher. His name was Mr. Snowden. It's unbelievable that I still remember it, but I do remember being encouraged by him. And we had an assignment to do a painting on burlap, of all things. And I painted a man sort of carrying a briefcase or something like that. And it was good, and he was surprised, and he was encouraging.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Education. I mean, everybody thinks you have to go to art school. There's some backlash to that now, but how was that? And where?
Well, that's an interesting question, and that really gets to any individual's path. So when I was going to classes at the Brooklyn Museum, I met a group of fellow students, teenagers, and many of them were applying to art schools, art programs. We were also encouraged to put together a portfolio. The fellow who was instructing us during this number of years that I was going there was very good at helping students in putting their portfolios together. I was not focused on going to art school for whatever reason, and I can't even tell you why that was. I ended up going to the State University of New York at Binghamton, which was one of the main university centers in New York. It still is. At the time that I went, it was not that big. It was probably somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 students, but growing very quickly due to pressures from the state. So my first interest when I got there was to get a bachelor's degree in psychology, and after taking 2 different classes in psychology, I thought, no, this isn't right for me. And then I decided I wanted to be an art studio major, and I found that it was incredibly difficult for whatever reasons to get into any of the studio programs. And I think that had to do with pressures in the growth, and as well as the size of the art studio program and its ability to accommodate students. So almost by default, I got a degree in art history. I found it easy. And I would say, though, by the time I was a junior, I was really tired of art history because, how can historians write about what actually artists are thinking? And the way that they write, this is me being very judgmental, the way that they write is very esoteric about the art. So it got to the point where I didn't find it attractive as a area of study anymore. And also in the meantime, because I decided majoring in art history wasn't very challenging, that I needed to do something challenging. And so I almost have an undergraduate degree. I'm maybe 1 or 2 classes short in economics.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow, that came out of left field.
So, once again, that's sort of, there's a dynamic here of art versus something more technical, and being able to sort of operate and function in an artistic domain as well as a more technical area. So I seem to be able to do that. In addition to that, when I was majoring in art history, my advisor ended up being this fellow that really who specialized in architectural history, and he sort of encouraged people to think about becoming city planners. So that ended up being a route that I followed, and I eventually applied to graduate schools in city planning. I was accepted and decided to go to the University of Pennsylvania and to their city planning program. And one of the principal reasons that I decided to do that, because it was in the Graduate School of Fine Arts, which included architecture, landscape architecture, and their graduate program in painting.
Wow, that's a weird combination.
Yeah, so it was an unusual place to be. There was some interaction between the city planning program and the architecture program. Not much interaction other than social with the people that were in the graduate painting program. So there was also the people who were getting their art history PhDs within that school. At first, I really did not like the city planning program. It was focused on policy. I was more interested in physical design, which tends towards architecture. I thought that the program that I was enrolled in would be more like that. But at the time, there was a push, primarily by the person who was the chairman of the program, to really align it along public policy. While I was there, you could, develop a specialty within city planning, and I decided to do their specialization in transportation because it had more to do with physical design than anything else that was within that program. And then from there, I actually entered into a professional pursuit, professional jobs in city planning, which eventually morphed into really doing more management consulting over time.
So,
well, I didn't really sort of finish something that I really needed to pursue.
Yeah.
My first job out of graduate school was in Maryland, in Baltimore, working for the state. And then in the evenings, I decided to enroll in classes at the Maryland Institute of Art. And I eventually enrolled in a painting class. And while I was during the first class, I sort of freaked out and was really sort of frightened about taking the class, and that had to do with it had to do with an experience that I had in college where I did take 2 semesters of painting, and the professor at the time would say very odd things to me, like, your paintings have no adventure, so therefore it's really an indication that your life has no adventure. And here I am, I'm like 19, 20 years old, and I'm thinking, well, what should my life be like other than being a college student? And I guess I wasn't maybe dropping enough drugs or smoking enough weed, I don't know. But anyway, when I was at the Maryland Institute, I dropped the class. I eventually picked it up. The instructor wanted to know why I was in his class one day, then coming back a week or so later to to take his class again. And I explained to him what my experience was, and he said, "Look, I'll just let you be. When you're ready, come and talk to me." And it worked out. He ended up being very influential. And I think if I hadn't met him, I don't know if I would have invested the way I have in continuing to be a painter and being an artist. He was very encouraging. He really said, you've got a lot of talent and you really need to do something more with it. It even got to the point where he said that I want you to keep coming back because I want to work with you.
That's interesting. It's kind of an odd left brain, right brain kind of thing, and then a reluctance to take the leap, which I think you're probably still trying to fathom in your work.
Well, I think so. I mean, I would say that there's been large periods of time where I really did think about taking the leap and being that full-time artist. When I had the job where I was doing the airport planning work for what eventually became Denver International Airport, I gave notice. I quit. And because I was going to take the leap, I was going to be this full-time artist. I had a studio in an old building in lower downtown Denver with other artists. So I was sort of prepped and ready to do this. I'd saved some money, so I felt like I had some cushion to be able to do it. But I have to say that after a week, I just freaked out. Even though I had given notice, I asked for my job back. Within that week, I met a woman who I knew in my mind, for whatever reason, I was going to marry. And I did marry, and we did get married eventually. So, taking that leap was difficult. It has always been difficult for me. It's always a question of, do you have sufficient self-confidence? Can you take the risks that come with being a full-time artist, of not having, a firm financial income on a steady basis? Would I be able to have children, be able to support children? Or even thinking, do I have the talent to be able to make it? I hate to say it, but one of the things that my parents did say to me, probably when I was about, somewhere around 19, and I was thinking of pursuing art, they said, "Yes, you're talented, but we don't know how much talent you really have. We don't know how talented you are." And if I had listened to my dad's interest was probably more along the lines of me becoming a CPA, which in some respects would have been sort of the worst thing imaginable for me to, even though I could do economics, being a CPA would have been the death of me.
Looking back on everything that you've done, I mean, do you have, everybody, nobody talks about it much anymore, but everybody, you felt like this pressure in college to have a style, to develop a style. And the style was a double-edged sword, because if it was a style that people wanted, they were very responsive to it, that was fantastic. Obviously, the opposite was true if nobody cared. But then the other thing about having a style is it's very much like having a hit song, and you're trying not to sing that at your 1,000th concert, and somebody in the audience always screams out they want to hear that song, and you're like, no, I'm not there anymore. I mean, so do you have a style? Has it evolved? Have you gone backwards? Have you gone forwards from that backwards position?
I think that's an interesting question, and not one that I've really thought about very definitively. I guess nobody's ever talked to me about style. It seemed like when I did go to the Brooklyn Museum, or I took classes at when I was at SUNY Binghamton, or even later on at Maryland Institute, people would set up a still life, and you're told to go paint it, and there's this implied. It's almost implied that you should do it as realistically as possible. You should take it as you see it, not as how you might interpret it or how you might feel it. A lot of what I did at the Brooklyn Museum, and even later on, was life, working with human figures, live
models.
Live models, and. But the interest was that you should get it all exactly anatomically correct, and that's what you should be producing. Now, and so that was defining me, and it was defining my struggle as to me being an artist, and it truly didn't work very well for me. When I started taking the class at Maryland Institute, this guy who was the instructor, who said, okay, I'll leave you alone.
What was his name?
His name is Stephen Gilbert. And he said, I'll leave you alone. But one of the things that he eventually did talk to me, and he seemed to observe this right away, is that, you're trying to work on these small canvases, whether, maybe the biggest was like 18 by 24. And he said, that doesn't work for you because you're physical. And really what you need to do is get a large canvas, go out to a hardware store and get some large, cheap brushes, and then try to create, a painting. And I'd say that following his advice, the first painting I did was this breakthrough. And it wasn't as if there was a style that had been dictated to me. It really sort of the beginning of the development of my own individual style. And it was a painting that I still have. My parents did eventually ask for it, and they hung it over their bed, which was very odd, given that I painted it about a relationship that I had had for a year when I was in graduate school. And it was probably the first serious relationship I ever had. And it's a painting of two people in a bed, and they're not dressed, they're naked, and the bed is positioned in a bay window, and you can see outside. You'd see Philadelphia-style row houses, and once again, it's the dynamic of those two individuals, and the woman is stretched out bare on the bed, and the man, you can only see the man's back sitting on the edge, and it really is, I titled the painting more recently, after many, many years, "It's Time to Call a Taxi," or "It's Time to Call an Uber." And it really, really sort of, even though I love this woman and I still think of her very fondly, I knew that this relationship wasn't right for me.
So that was that point.
Yeah, it was that point. And the painting is a representation. It represents that moment in time where I knew that, it wasn't going to work out. It wasn't for me. And that, I think, it was the beginning of me defining a style. And the style has evolved. It is still evolving. And I would have to say that it will always continue to be an expressionistic style. And maybe more akin to German expressionism than anything else.
Your style is more visceral, emotional than it is visual. And it's interesting to me looking at your figures. There's always the brooding figure, to use the art historical term, the brooding figure, but then you start looking at that figure as that figure brooding because they're spoiled, because they've been rejected, because they haven't been accepted, which is different from being rejected. And it's kind of interesting because you talk about a narrative, being an abstract painter, there really isn't a narrative. This pattern and repetition and things like that, and it's for the viewer to see what they want to see. I can't dictate. I can't even tell you what I did. Never mind trying to thrust that onto a viewer. Whereas with your work, it's funny. I had this experience. I'm still tingling about it. I bumped into an artist on exhibit. He's been dead now for 12 years at Bridgewater State University. His name is Jack Wolf. And it was almost the same kind of experience of looking at your work, except his was, he was present. In his abstract work, he was present. I could actually feel him making the brushstrokes. I could. It was the weirdest thing. It was like some sort of cosmic stuff still tingling around. With his more representational work, it was amazing how he got into the skin of people, so much so that in one painting he led me to believe, before I knew anything about him, that he was African American, because how he painted all of these characters, these figures, as individually, and the skin tones, their facial structure, their body, their poses, and so on and so forth. With yours, they have this incredible presence in the room, and to me, there's like a sound. You don't hear the sound, you only feel the reverberation of it. It's as if it's not the slapping, it's that part afterwards. It still hangs in a room until it's gone, like a pop.
Well, I think I've got a couple of responses to what you just said. So I'm not always present when I'm painting. I mean, I'm there physically, but I do try to move to a state where I don't even know what I'm necessarily doing. Maybe it's akin to what people will describe as a runner's high, or what my wife will say is you're just high on the fumes, but I really don't think that's the case. So it's sort of this other state, essentially.
Is it almost like, I think it's called duene, the flamenco dancers get to that state where they're seeing themselves, but they're not in themselves.
That's exactly right. And some people describe it as flow. And I think that's the ultimate in terms of for me when I'm painting, because what happens then is that there is this flow, but the canvas almost takes over. And then I'm doing things that I'm not sure, when I look at it, how did I even do it? Because I don't even know if I could replicate what I just did. So for me, that's when the best painting is actually occurring, and that's what I attempt to achieve over and over again. So there is this there's a desire in some ways of not being present and just letting the painting happen. Now, you did talk about sort of this reverberation.
Reverberation, yeah.
Reverberation.
Yeah. That's you brought up the word. I couldn't even remember it.
Yeah, but anyway, it makes me recall that when I was taking a class at the Maryland Institute, I became friendly with a woman who really said that she told me that I gave off like this sort of intensity, this vibration. She could walk into a room and not even see me, but know that I'm there because she could feel my vibration. I don't know. Maybe she was just trying to get to know me, pick me up, get to know me in another way.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that exists, that I am like that. Maybe I do. I think I do give off sort of a degree of an intensity. I've had some other responses that I could recall, but probably are not worth talking about. But at the same time, it makes me think of this. I have a first cousin, and every time I see him, which is not that frequently, I can feel his intensity. He just vibrates this intensity, and he's a wonderful human being. But it's almost sort of like I don't know if it's scary, but it's palpable, and I don't even know how to deal with it. And I wonder if I give off a similar kind of intensity. And I think that, it might be, once again, sort of genetic, in that, it is something that is evident among some people on my maternal side, that they sort of are like that.
Have you ever heard anyone speaking of your work, standing in front of your work, not realizing who you were? And what did you come away with from that, if that happened?
I would say that more than anything is that I see people standing there and then they just move on. And I'm not sure if they're responding. I've had a couple of instances where people realize after looking at the work that I'm standing next to them, and they feel that they're compelled to say something, and their usual response is, "Oh, well, that's interesting," and I know then that they really didn't respond to the work. There are instances where there are people that are close to me that, and, family members even, that I don't feel, this has been upsetting to me, that even though they know me, they're familiar with me, there's no verbal response to my artwork. And that is, I don't know what to say about that. It's difficult to digest.
Yeah, it is, because that is a part of us hanging on the wall.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes it's the part we know about, and sometimes the part we have no idea about. Sometimes it's frightening someday. And it just runs through the whole gamut of emotions. Now, I know you through the group that we formed of the alum of what was SMU, which is now SMU is Southeastern Massachusetts University, and it evolved into the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, the UMass system of colleges, universities rather. And so our educational background and your educational background are totally different. And I'm sure you see some similarities amongst us in our trainings, and some of those experiences you just can't ever cozy up to because you weren't there. How does that make you feel?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I could quickly expect to feel like an outsider. But for whatever reason, I don't feel like an outsider. I feel like I've been totally embraced by this group, which is really sort of very interesting, particularly since you all have a shared history. You spent formative years together, not just as people learning to be artists, but people, it's a formative time when you're in your late teens and your early 20s and in terms of figuring out who you are and maybe the possible path that you're going to follow. So it's interesting in that I feel embraced. I feel like it's been, I can't exactly say it's a lifesaver, but it's given me a peer group that I can relate to, I can converse with. What I can't share is, you go off and you talk about, some professor and how, what that experience was, in that person's class. So clearly there's no way that I could possibly relate to that. What I do find very attractive about the group is the way people do talk about art, how they're willing to talk about individuals' art that might be very different than theirs. The other thing that I think is very attractive about the group is that everybody who is in it paints very differently. There's no similarity in terms of what people are doing. There are abstract painters, and then there's someone who used to be an abstract expressionist who is now doing very realistic landscapes. There's someone who's doing maybe fantasy-oriented type work, and it all doesn't matter. The other thing that I really like about it is that for whatever reason, as I've tried to get to know more artists in the last several years in Southeast Massachusetts, what I was first encountering is all these people that were doing pastel landscapes. And I'm like, who in the world does pastel landscapes? I mean, why is this so popular? I mean, years ago, particularly when I was in Denver and I was working fairly full-time as an artist and showing in different galleries in Denver, there was nobody showing doing pastels, or no galleries that were showing pastels. But for what I was saying is like this whole focus and investment in this. And what I really enjoy is that there's nobody in this group that is doing something like that. They're doing, their painting their work is adventurous. And I think that's one of the things that greatly appeals to me.
I think one of the things, too, about the group is the bonding. And I think that bonding is a theme or a sub-theme in your work. So you definitely were good for us. And we hope that, we've been good for you. The group, by the way, is called T.E.C.M, T-E.C.M, and it stands for Tonieri, Eliot, Cummings, and McCoy, the 4 pillars of our education. And it's kind of we still get very emotional speaking about that. And as I've been sitting in this chair hosting this podcast, so far we've had 2 Swaineys, 2 Swain School of Design alum, and they have that same fire in their belly to this very, very day. I mean, it's like it happened yesterday. And to me, that's quite amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. And as I think I've said this, but I'm very grateful to be, to have had this invitation and to be part of the group. And I also feel like that, I've gotten to know most of the people in the group. There are some people that I don't know all that well, but in the meantime, I feel like, there's probably 3 or 4 that I've gotten to know well, and I do appreciate not only being connected with them with regards to my art. I value what they have to say about art, as well as what they've been able to contribute to me as they observe the development of my art over the last several years. But I also have, at the same time, gained some friendships, a number of friendships, and I do enjoy that, and I appreciate that.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's that time. We're coming to the end of another podcast episode. Once again, I'm your host, Ron Fortier. Let's thank our guest, Bob Brodesky, or Robert Brodesky. Do you prefer Bob? I should have asked you before.
It's interesting. I've mostly gone by Bob, but lately, in the last several years, more and more people are calling me Robert. And as people see my artwork and are reacting, they're calling me Robert.
That's interesting. I'm Ronald. I prefer to be called Ron. So I'm gonna keep an ear open for that.
So just don't call me Bobby.
Just don't call you Bobby. Yeah. Bob, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we go?
All I want to say is that I'm very grateful and I feel very grateful to be able to have this talent. And, there are moments of questioning your talent, but I think fundamentally underneath it all, I know that I am, and that it is something that I'm always going to do. I'm always going to challenge myself. There's a part of me that thinks that I'm going to be famous someday, whether or not I'm just kidding myself. That's probably more likely. But anyway, I know this is what I am. This is who I am, and I'm going to always continue to do it. And people should be encouraged to be honest with themselves and true to themselves.
Thank you. In Focus, this In Focus podcast is brought to you in part by theartistindex.com. The Artist Index is a local resource for artists, art professionals, and art lovers. Till next time, thank you from all of us at the Artist Index. Bye-bye.